Choirs worship God in a setting of awe-inspiring beauty and elaborate architecture. Do you imagine dazzling displays of gold and silver with an array of countless precious stones? This is, but it is not the complete picture. Perhaps you see heaven as the inner surface of a huge concave dome that extends out over the entire earth. As the edge of the dome approaches the horizon, it sometimes gives the impression that it will fall short, but it never does. It always covers the earth beneath it. Almost all inhabitants of Earth have a certain impression of vast possibilities. We need to bear in mind that various terms are used to describe heaven. The single noun heaven emphasizes its overall unity. Other expressions seem to refer to its various aspects or parts. For example, the terms heavenlies or heavenly places suggest a number of different places, all of which are combined under the heading heaven. These places may be given over at various times to different beings and different activities. In 2 Corinthians 12, 2-4, Paul writes, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or whether out of the body I do not know, God knows. Such a one was caught up to the third heaven. And I know such a man, whether in the body or out of the body I do not know, God knows, how he was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words, which it is not lawful or not possible for a man to utter. This passage indicates that there are 3 heavens in total, one immediately above the other. The highest is what Paul describes as the third heaven. It is the place of paradise and the place of personal dwelling of God, the most sacred place in the universe. It is passages such as this one that give us the concept often associated with heaven, purity or holiness. The words uttered there are so sacred that they cannot be repeated outside. Paradisos, paradise, is the Greek word for a garden. It represents God's garden in heaven. Paradise is the ultimate destination of all sinners who have truly repented and who have persevered in the life of faith. On the cross, Jesus promised the penitent thief that the 2 of them would be together that day in paradise. And Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, today
Que tu primer día sea el lunes.
Like many people, I'm working from home.
I'm doing my college courses online.
So why not do my work and earn...
The ancient Sumerian tablets describe the stories of the gods, their adventures, deeds, and battles, leading to the creation of the heavens, the earth, and humanity. Many of these stories are interpreted to be describing planets and the formation of the early solar system, and in many ways, the theories appear to add up. However, as the tablet stories continue on, they are read in a different way, as if these gods were not deities at all, but physical beings who came to the earth.
Something is here, I can feel it.
When we're looking into the stories and interpretations of the Sumerian tablets, there comes a point when we have to change our perspective as to the nature of who or what these gods were. For so long now, we've been observing the interpretations where these deities are essentially a storytelling method to explain the creation of our solar system in the form of planets. The electric universe and the Nibiru theory covers a few different possibilities about how these events could have transpired. However, as we look to the continuation of these stories, we begin to see the interpretations change. Looking at the Enuma Elish and a wide number of other Sumerian tablet stories, we see these gods interpreted as if they were actual physical beings who are believed to have played a part in the creation of humanity. This is one of the many reasons that interpreting the tablets is strange, and why historians may often choose to perceive the entire thing as a series of metaphors instead. In the main interpretation that came from Sitchin, he believed that these beings came from the planet Nibiru. However, other scholars who also interpret these gods as beings sometimes forego the conversation of Nibiru entirely, and suggest instead that they simply came from somewhere else, such as the Pleiades, which are written about quite commonly in the tablets. Keep this in mind as we move forward, because while we'll be focusing on the general interpretations here, there are tons of variations and ideas about how this could have played out. Going back to the Enuma Elish, it ends with Enki, or Ea, creating humanity because Marduk commissioned it so. In other Sumerian stories, we find a similar description, except it is Enlil in the place of Marduk, because Marduk replaced Enlil in the Babylonian version. Enlil and Marduk are very similar though. They are both considered the supreme leaders of the Anunnaki. The only main difference is that Marduk is Enki's son, and Enlil is Enki's half-brother. But herein we find perhaps one of the biggest criticisms of Sitchin's work. Sometimes Ea or Enki appears as a planet, and other times he seems to be a flesh and blood deity. It can be very confusing, and it's up to all of us to explore the possibilities. Now, I suppose it doesn't really matter if we're looking at the entire story as an allegory, but observing it as actual historical events can definitely cause confusion in this regard. So for the sake of telling the story, we'll be using the name Ea to express the planet, and Enki to describe the physical being. Just be aware that if you're looking these up online, you will find many places where their names overlap with each other in the mythologies. To that end, most of the deities you'll find have multiple names anyways. Enki is also known as Enki, Nidamud, and Ninsaku throughout the various tellings, and as we previously described, he was the god of water, mischief, crafts, wisdom, and creation. Enlil, his brother on the other hand, was known as Elul and Nunamir, and he was the Sumerian god of the air, and was more powerful than any other elemental deity, eventually being worshipped as the king of the gods. He was also the son of Anu, and together, the three of them formed a triad which governed the heavens, earth, and underworld, or after Anu, Enlil was the most powerful of the Mesopotamian gods, keeper of the Tablet of Destinies, which contained the fates of both gods and humans. But in that case, who was Anu, and what were the Anunnaki? That's a great question, but before we can answer, we're going to have to look at another question first. So let's do the time warp again, and return to that burning question from so long ago. Who are the Nephilim? As we've discussed, the Bible speaks of these people or beings called the Nephilim. There's a lot of debate today as to who and what these beings were. Looking back to the original Hebrew translation, we see the word Nephilim directly translates to the fallen ones. Today, many believe this to mean that they were fallen angels, which seems to be what was depicted in the 2014 film, Noah. Sitchin, on the other hand, believed the translation was a bit different. He read fallen ones to mean those who came down, and that they didn't fall, but landed here in some kind of spaceship. To him, the Nephilim were the people of the fiery rockets. Of course, this is one of those translations that doesn't seem to often hold up well to scrutiny, but it's interesting given the context of the stories nonetheless. We should note that in his writings, Sitchin commonly used the name Nephilim in tandem with the Anunnaki, also written sometimes as Enuna. But personally, I'm not certain that this is the best use of these titles. You see, the Anunnaki are believed to have been the descendants of Anu, the Skyfather, and the two most prominent leaders of this group are Enki and Enlil. Beyond that, there's a lot of inconsistency between how many Anunnaki there were and what roles they fulfilled. For example, in the Enuma Elish, there's only a small handful of gods were introduced. Tiamat, Enki, Marduk, you know the group, but then out of nowhere, Marduk places 600 gods on the earth and 300 in the heavens, and no explanation is ever given about who these gods were or where they came from. Later on, in our own history, the ancient Hittites identified the Anunnaki as the oldest generation of gods. who were overthrown and banished to the underworld by the younger gods, which is curiously what is described in the Enuma Elish itself, and reflects the stories of the old Titan gods in Greece being overthrown by a younger pantheon. In the Bible, we see the following passage. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Well, they better be portly and romantic, because if that line is implying anything else, I don't like it. The Bible describes that they were the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, essentially making the Nephilim be a little bit more like demigods, a hybridized species born of the gods, who would have been the Anunnaki and humans together. It's theorized this could be where demigods in general came from, such as Hercules, who is the son of the god Zeus, and the mortal woman named Alcmene. The result of this made Hercules fully human, yet who had the gift of the tremendous strength of a god. Of course, depending on who you're speaking with, the concept of Nephilim could just come from a mistranslation of the Bible, and the Anunnaki being simply an ancient Mesopotamian archetype. For the sake of the story, I will be telling the tale from the perspective that the Anunnaki are physical beings, but as always, feel free to interpret this however you like, and please share your thoughts in the comments below as to what you believe these Anunnaki were. This story begins several 100,000 years ago, and starts in the midst of a drama involving the Anunnaki, the planet Nibiru, and our Earth. Sitchin wrote that he believed that the planet Nibiru was inhabited with life at one point in its history. He wrote that the dominant species on the planet were bipedal in stature, and had evolved conscious minds. They were the Anunnaki. These beings were said to be much bigger than we are today, with the women being about 10 to 12 feet, and the men being 14 to 16 feet tall, which you might recall relates with the various levels of consciousness we explored way back in Spirit Science 11 and 12. The Anunnaki were not immortal, but they had exceptionally long lifetimes compared to what we are used to. Sitchin's translations estimated their lifespan to be somewhere between 360,000 and 500,000 Earth years. However, another scholar, Lawrence Gardner, suggested the Anunnaki only had lifespans of 50,000 years. The Anunnaki have been described in several different ways. Most commonly, they are depicted as tall, bearded men, and sometimes there are women and children depicted as well. However, they sometimes are interpreted to have been crocodile-like in nature, or with reptilian features. If you're familiar with a lot of New Age ideas, you might have heard of the idea of reptilians, which are said to be bipedal lizard creatures, and are usually the antagonists in the human story. However, just as there are reptile humanoid statues from ancient Sumer, so too are the Anunnaki also depicted as bird-like, which Sitchin believed is simply their space helmets. Either way, both of these depictions of the Anunnaki, as reptiles or birds, are scarce, with the tall bearded men version being the most prominent. I do believe that regardless of what these beings look like, it's the bearded image of these so-called deities that gave us our common Christian image today, God as an older gentleman with a long beard. To that end, even Sitchin fought the idea that the Anunnaki were reptilian beings, and this was because he wanted his theory to fit with the Bible. To him, the gods could not be in the form of the biblical serpent. Nevertheless, these different depictions have given rise to a lot of online debate about what these beings could look like, if they're even literal physical beings to begin with. Many proponents of the reptilian theory suggest that these beings are actually shapeshifters as well, and can change their form at will, which is why there are different depictions of them throughout history. This adds an entirely new dimension to the discussion, and gives rise to the popular conspiracy theory that they could even be living among us today in secret. At any rate, for the focus of this series, we're going to keep to the depiction of the Anunnaki as these bearded humanoids, and we'll come back around to the alternate depictions sometime later on. One of the most important Sumerian gods is the Sky Father named Anu. A number of Sumerian texts discuss Anu, but not all agree to every aspect of his existence, such as where he came from, or what he actually is. Despite the fact that we previously observed Anu as Uranus, on an allegorical level, Anu could simply be the way that the Sumerians personified the sky, and therefore the Anunnaki are those who came from the sky and outer space. The name Anu is the root word of Anunnaki, which is sometimes translated as offspring of Anu, or princely offspring. This is why Sitchin believed that they were the species that came from above and beyond our planet. Anu was the heavenly father, and those who descended from the sky were his children. Once again, we see descriptions of God today as passed down throughout history. In Christianity, God is called the Heavenly Father, the origins of which we find with Anu According to Sitchin's translations and theories on the subject, the Anunnaki were technologically advanced beings living on the planet Nibiru. Let me also be clear that in Sitchin's book, The Lost Book of Enki, he puts forth a potential version of his ancient past drama, which is really epic, but also very elaborate and long. Honestly, this book would make a great Hollywood movie, just saying. Actually, in a way, it kind of already has, and I just want to take a moment to give a huge shout out to the band and team behind Messengers of the Wind, an animated rock opera that you can watch right now on YouTube. The whole thing is seriously amazing, and I just had to give it some mad props right here and now. As for today's exploration of this theory, we're just going to be going over the essentials. Otherwise, we could literally be here for a week.
Who's next?
Sometime around 450,000 years ago, long after the event between Nibiru and the planet Tiamat, the Anunnaki began having a problem with their planet. As we discussed earlier, this planet had a very strange orbit, which took it far away from the sun for long periods of time. Sitchin interpreted from his tablets that the planet had a lot of internal heat, which kept things alive through long distances of space. However, over time, and with the cooling of the planet, and potentially even the widening out of its rather sharp orbit, Nibiru grew colder and colder during its long voyages away from the sun, and the planet was slowly becoming less habitable. Sitchin suggested that the Anunnaki scientists decided on a solution that would strengthen their atmosphere and hold heat in for significantly longer periods of time, making it possible to survive in the far reaches of space. The Anunnaki decided that they would gather large amounts of gold and pulverize it into a fine powder and release it into their atmosphere, essentially creating a heat container for their planet. Believe it or not, our scientists have considered the exact same thing, putting light-reflecting particles into our stratosphere to help fix the ozone layer and cool our ever-warming planet. And so, in their attempt to solve their problem, they began looking for large quantities of gold in our solar system, as their planet didn't have the large quantities they needed to coat an entire atmosphere with gold. The Anunnaki has a capacity of space travel, though Sitchin believed that at the time, they weren't much further advanced than we are right now, since they didn't seem to have the ability to travel to other solar systems in their search. They scanned all of the planets in our solar system until they found what they were looking for, large deposits of gold right here on Earth. As the story goes, when Nibiru first came into our solar system, the Anunnaki would deploy a team of workers to Earth's orbit with one singular purpose: to mine gold. In the process of doing this, they also established a way station on Mars, which would help in shuttling the gold back to Nibiru once it was mined. Sitchin also believed that they had, during this time, built the face on Mars as a monument to an Anunnaki who had died there, after playing a pivotal role in finding the gold, which was going to save their planet. To lightly touch on the subject of the face on Mars, when you investigate this yourself, you'll find two prominent stories. One is the official response from NASA, which says that it's just a natural rock formation which, due to the way the light was hitting it at the time of the photograph, created this image of a face, but ultimately, it's just an illusion. Generally, those who question this perspective are often subject to ridicule, and so of course we have to go there. We wouldn't be spirit scientists if we didn't. On the other side of the spectrum, you'll find ex-NASA scientists and astronauts, retired U.S. Army command sergeants, and a university physics professor, along with a number of ancient astronauts and conspiracy theorists, to put forth that the place, along with a set of nearby mountain structures that look an awful lot like pyramids, are the remnants of an ancient civilization. Now, please know that I fully understand this is a huge claim, and one that we don't take lightly, so please allow me a moment to share with you what we've come up with while investigating this whole thing.
I'm out of bullets.
In a lecture given in 2009, Bob D., a retired command sergeant major, said the following.
Ladies and gentlemen, my government, NASA,
Fresh ammo coming up.
which many of us in the United States say stands for never a straight answer. In the human race,
I'm out of bullets.
one beholds a skill of the entire problem. It's like the mission, flying around the moon, the language on the moon, the walking back here. If you take 40 rolls of film of those events, now we're talking about several thousand individual things that were taken, that the so-called soldiers, who did not have a right to see.
That all you got?
Oh, yeah, it's like
I become curious. I'm a retired community architect. I was never witness of having a lot of people.
Now, another man named Brian O'Leary, who was a NASA astronaut and a close friend of Carl Sagan for many years, expressed in an interview with Project Camelot that a huge rift was created in their friendship over the face on Mars.
Carl and I debated
Come on now, creep.
this very
Know your ass is there.
intelligently because not only was Carl wrong, he also fudged data. He published a picture of the face in Parade magazine, a popular article saying that the face is just a natural formation. But he doctored the picture to make it not look like a face. And I began to realize just directly from a scientific point of view, not only hearsay, that this man was colluding with NASA, that there might be more to this than before. And then when I started studying things like MJ12 and other organizations that were covering up the UFO phenomenon, Carl was on a committee with a number of notable people. There was a report issued by the Brookings Institution in 1961, and that's about when I knew Carl. During those years, the 60s, I worked closely with him.
Keep it down.
Now, he and this other group said, well, if any ETs ever showed up on the Earth, it has to be covered up. That's the only way we're going to be able to manage this, because it would be too much for
Razor wire defense is set.
So their recommendation to the government in 1961 was to cover up the UFO phenomenon. And I think in a way that provided a justification for the ongoing cover-up.
Let's do this.
Way back in 61, let's
Explosives
keep
going
things
out.
secret.
But Bob and Brian aren't alone in their claims. We also find very accomplished scientists and mechanical engineers who are involved with NASA, who basically share the same story. We'll share some links in the author comments. You can read up on all of these responses to Cydonia and the face on Mars. And with that, it's about time we return to our story. Now, in the Enuma Elish, it says that Marduk placed 300 Anunnaki in the heavens and 600 on the earth, or the netherworld, depending on the
Electric
translation.
grid activated.
And all of these Anunnaki were led by 12 leaders. Sitchin believed that this was attempting to describe that there were 600 worker Anunnaki who came to Earth to dig the gold, who were led by 12 supervisors or bosses. The 300 gods in the heavens were believed to be another 300 Anunnaki who stayed in orbit on their mothership above the surface of the planet, similar to how we have the International Space Station in orbit today. To begin the mission, the Anunnaki first went to the Middle East. Sitchin believed it to be in the area of present-day Iraq, where in 7 days they established Eridu. Eridu is commonly believed to be the oldest Sumerian site across all of Mesopotamia. And is it possible that this is where the 7 days of creation come from in Genesis? Either way, it was here that they established their headquarters. For the gold, however, they went to mine a specific valley in Southeast Africa, where the largest natural deposit of gold was known to be. Of the 12 supervisors, Enlil was the leader of the whole operation, and Enki was second in command. The Anunnaki carved deep into the earth and dug large quantities of gold. Then, every 36 years when the planet Nibiru came around, they would shuttle the gold to their homeworld, and return to Google while Nibiru traveled in orbit again. Now, according to Sitchin and supporting theorists, they dug for a very long time, about 100,000 to 150,000 years before the rebellion took place. Somewhere between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, the Anunnaki workers rebelled against their bosses. They did not want to keep digging in the mines. One can easily imagine them saying, "We've been digging gold for 150,000 years, and we're tired of it. We're done." The rebellion presented a problem,
We got a creep.
and something had to be done. This is where Enlil and Enki come into the story in a very prominent way. If you recall in the original Sumerian story, we had 2 versions of the concept of humans. In one, it was Namu's idea, and in the other, Enlil told Namu the idea, who gave it to Enki. So as our story goes, during the time of the rebellion, Enki's mother communicated with Enki while he slept, sending him a vision saying, "O my son, arise from thy bed, from thy slumber, work what is wise, fashion serpents for the gods." Due to the variations, it's not clear about where the true origins of this vision come from, but nevertheless, Enki awakens from this vision-filled slumber and suggests creation of servants for the gods. According to the story, Enki himself creates human beings of the mixture of clay and the blood of the slain Kinu. This is another time where we have 2 different interpretations converging on each other. because earlier we saw how Kingu was interpreted to be the moon, but now Kingu seems to be a being with flesh and blood, for it is with Kingu's DNA that provides the necessary ingredients of human genetics. What is Kingu, really? Looking at the rest of this description, we see a few more possible interpretations. To some, the term clay doesn't mean like physical clay, but earthly matter, including pre-existing life, and many believe that this line actually means that humans were created in a synthesis of Anunnaki DNA and the DNA of the highest form of primitive life available on the Earth. This then would suggest that humans weren't necessarily created, but came from a modification of an earlier hominid species, which was most likely either Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis. For years, we've been struggling to find the missing link between our species, Homo sapiens, and our predecessors, and this search is still taking place today. Perhaps this is our missing link. What's especially interesting about this is the timeline, because we currently understand that Homo sapiens emerged roughly 200 to 300,000 years ago, which is said to be right about when the Anunnaki rebellion took place. Throughout the tablets, genetics and the transformation of the human being are recurring themes. In the Flower of Life books, which originally put a lot of different pieces together in these stories, Drunvalo puts forth another piece of information that is very intriguing. He describes that in order to create a new species, you need both a father species and a mother species. Just like in order to create a child, you need a mother and a father. Drunvalo said that the Anunnaki were our mother species because they did the actual birthing, and that our father species were actually the Sirians, or at least a species from the star system Sirius. So to be very clear, these beings came from Sirius, not Sirius, which is one of the closest stars to us and the brightest star in the sky. Well, not counting the sun. Okay, second brightest. Now, while the Anunnaki were primarily a third-dimensional species, the Sirians were fourth-dimensional, and so were able to come to a planet in a way that was probably less sketchy from a wrinkle in time. In a stunning ritual, he described that these beings traveled through interdimensional and entered directly into the union of the Hall of the Demented and before the Flower of Life, the sacred part of all consciousness. Because they understood everything was life and energy, in their fourth dimension they created 32 vegetable slabs, and then laid down upon them and entered into a long meditation, conceiving a new consciousness. Then Enki, in the third dimension, created a laboratory human egg, a genetic fusion of Anunnaki DNA and the DNA of the previous hominid species, and put them into Anunnaki women who were volunteering to do this. The new seeds of consciousness created by the Sirians then entered into the eggs and impregnated the women who nurtured them for what probably felt like 9 months or so and bore them as children. Now, let's be clear that this part about the Sirians is not found in the Sumerian tablets themselves, and so it's not grounded in any ancient writing, but it's a very compelling idea nonetheless, especially because of its implication, that the Anunnaki developed our bodies, but not our souls. And I mean, who knows? Maybe they were the birdmen. Then again, it might all just be a fun idea and nothing more, because just as much as the Sirians could be said to be our father species, it could also be said that Homo erectus was our father species, the seed that was nurtured into something new. Ultimately, after all is said and done, the tablets write that the Anunnaki had created an entirely new species of life, Earth, and that species is us. The legends in the ancient tablets are very clear that the Anunnaki created humans to support and serve the gods, and help maintain all of creation. A lot of questions still remain though. What happened once we were created? And how did we earn our freedom? The plan for the Anunnaki was to create a more advanced race than Earth had at the time, used for the purpose of mining gold and performing other laborious tasks. This, according to the interpretations of the ancient Sumerian records, was our original purpose as a species, a slave race to mine gold. Sitchin believed that the Anunnaki's original intention was to use us to mine all of the gold that they needed, and then destroy our race and leave the planet once they had no more use for us. What's amazing about this interpretation is that there are some incredible discoveries we've made in recent years that lend some merit to the story. As we previously discussed, we have first the timeline itself. The sudden emergence of Homo sapiens 200 to 300,000 years ago is a huge piece in the puzzle. What caused this dramatic jump in evolution from Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis at this time? Today, archaeologists still have a difficult time explaining it. I don't want to outright suggest that it was explicitly the Anunnaki. Maybe it was a big cosmic monolith in 2001, The Space Odyssey. That'd be pretty cool. Then again, the tablets say it was ancient, so Let's go with that for now. Now, here's where we have something very curious, and if you haven't heard it before, brace yourself, because it's pretty amazing. Right in the area where the Sumerian records state that we mined gold, archaeologists have found what may actually be gold mines. And these ancient ruins are believed by some to date back as far as 200,000 years. Stay open while we go through this, because there's a lot of mystery here, and even more debate around the nature of these ruins, so we'll do our best to cover all sides of the argument. Archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians don't really have an answer about how these colossal sites could exist back from 200,000 years ago, which is why many still debate they're only 25,000 years old, or somewhere between those numbers. The general consensus in the mainstream world is that they're just early human settlements, not gold mines. However, even if this is true, even if these sites are not ancient gold mines, the magnitude of these ruins, even dating them at their most recent date, throws a huge wrench in our modern preconceptions about the origins of agriculture and civilization, with historian Professor Peter Delius and archaeologist Dr. Alex Schumann putting forth that there are clear indications and agricultural innovation long before the colonial era. Along with these amazing insights, we also have the discovery of what is now called Adam's calendar, which is a curious arrangement of ancient blocks aligned perfectly with the movements of the sun, solstices, and equinoxes.
Come on, creep.
Today, these sites are known as the Baconi Ruins, named after the Baconi people who trace back to the early 16th century, despite clear evidence that these ruins date back thousands upon thousands of years prior. The ruins themselves today are generally neglected by the government and heritage institutions, and are getting damaged over time, but some have been saved thanks to the initiatives of private owners. These ruins are a giant complex of circular structures, connected by channels and suspended in an expansive web of agricultural terraces. If we assume these were dwellings, some suggest they could have held an absolutely massive population, which is unimaginable to think something like this could exist so long ago. But now, here's where things get even more interesting. Extensive electronic measurements that took place at these ruins in 2011 have shown that the circular stone ruins are actually energy-generating devices, using the natural sounds that emanate from the earth to create strong electromagnetic fields as a result of sound amplification. The shapes of these circular ruins are specific and unique because each circle represents the cymatic pattern of the sound energy as it appears on the surface of the earth at that point. And just briefly, in case you're unfamiliar with it, cymatics is a word derived from the Greek chyma, meaning wave, and takanatica, meaning matters pertaining to waves. The study of cymatics was pioneered by a medical doctor, a natural scientist named Hans Jenny. He was able to create a physical representation of vibration, or how sound manifests into form, through the medium of various materials. This fascinating work offers profound insight into both the physical sciences and esoteric philosophy, and illustrates the very principles which inspired the ancient Greek philosophers. These cymatic images are truly awe-inspiring, not only for their visual beauty in portraying the inherent responsiveness of matter to sound, but also because they inspire a deep recognition that we too are intrinsically connected to the same complex vibrational matrix of reality. As we explored way back in Spirit Science 7, the particles that make up the entire universe move in these very same geometric wave-like patterns, so we can see that at every level of reality, the essence of cymatics is present. Now, let us pretend that these really are ancient gold mines, as many people today believe they are. It would appear then that with a deep understanding of the phenomenon of cymatics, that the Anunnaki were able to mine gold, or perhaps move it around, using the frequencies of the earth, and thus their gold mines were designed very specifically to resonate with the sounds of the planet, allowing them to do their work more easily. We know today that sound levitation is fully a thing, and may even be a great key to flying vehicles one day. So is it possible that these sites are the ancient remnant of sound levitation and like uses on an absolutely massive scale? Some sites, such as this one, are even more unique, having seemed to be constructed to very precise phi ratios. I know that so far we've been drawing all of these miners with pickaxes, and we're going to continue to, but please know that this is for the ease of telling the story for us today. To these ancient miners, they probably think pickaxes were a fairly limited and primitive technology. Regarding these ruins, the man responsible for leading the research on the electromagnetic fields of these sites is Michael Pellinger, who wrote the following about his experience there. I have measured these spectacular energies and electromagnetic waves, and therefore do not hesitate to make these claims. The fact that these circles are all connected by the stone channels makes it very clear to any scientist who works with electricity or energy that the stone circle complex is a giant energy-generating grid that was most likely used in the mining and processing of gold on a scale unimaginable to us today. From Michael's work, he suggests that there was a civilization living at the tip of South Africa, mining gold for nearly 200,000 years, a civilization which at some point completely and suddenly vanished from the radar. Now, for those of us today who don't believe these stories are true, we must ask the question, what in the blazes were ancient primitive humans doing with all that gold? What did we use it for? Keep in mind, the general consensus is that at this stage in human evolution, we were purely hunter-gatherers. It was not until after 9,500 BCE that the 8 so-called founder crops of agriculture appeared, and these ruins are dated significantly older than this. We know today that gold is a very soft metal, and not really something that we could use like other metals, certainly not if we were so primitive, as most of the world's historians agree that we were. Critics often put forth against Michael Tellinger and his claims that these sites could not possibly be gold mines, because there is no ancient artifact that we know of today made of gold that exists before 4600 BCE. Then again, if the Anunnaki were shipping the gold off to their planet or wherever, it would make sense that humans wouldn't be crafting things out of it anyways. It is most certainly an extremely unique puzzle, made even more amazing by the fact that Sitchin wrote the Anunnaki were mining gold in Southeast Africa way back in 1976, long before the discovery of these sites truly came to light. For all of the people who claim that Sitchin didn't even know how to read the tablets, and all of his interpretations are wrong, I pose the question, how is this even possible? Now, I know what you might be thinking. Michael Tellinger read a Sitchin book, went to Africa, and then claimed some old ruins he found were gold mines. And you know what?
There could
Maybe
still
he
be
really
people
was
in
looking
these
for it.
houses.
However, if you consider that he is correct, and that the energetic and cymatic readings of the site truly do indicate that they were gold mines, then it really does call us to reevaluate everything we think
Can
we know
anyone hear
about
me?
human origins.
What are you doing?
The back and forth
I'm not
between
leaving
historians and
anyone behind.
archaeologists on
We've
this,
done what
and
we can,
even
yeah,
naming the
sure.
ruins after the Bikini
Evacuation's
people,
over.
reminds me of exactly the same thing that happened around the age of the Sphinx. Today, Egyptologists stand definitively behind the idea that the Sphinx was built around 2500 BC by the pharaoh Khafre, despite significant archaeological evidence, such as the weathering patterns of the Sphinx, that prove it is significantly older, at least 12,000, if not 35,000 years old. The way that skeptics treat Sitchin and his work, you'd think he was just throwing darts at a map, and wherever they landed was wherever he pegged his story to take place. But if those ruins truly are the remnants of gold mines, then we have to ask the question, was Sitchin actually
see
able
anyone
to
in
read
these
the
houses.
tablets better than everyone else in recent history?
Rest easy, Shaw.
Today, most historians believe that the Sumerian tablets don't speak of gold mines at all, and that Sitchin essentially just made it all up. In the 12th planet, Sitchin explains his reasoning, which actually has to do with Apsu, also written as Abzu. If you recall, Apsu is regarded as the aquifers under Mesopotamia, and Sitchin translated him to actually mean the sun.
Found a
And
breaching
after
charge.
Enki took the throne, Apsu became a location rather than a deity. Sitchin writes, the Sumerian term Abzu, which scholars have accepted to mean watery deep, requires a fresh and critical analysis. Literally, the term meant primeval deep source, not necessarily of waters. According to Sumerian grammatical rules, either of two syllables of any term could precede the other without changing its meaning, with the result that Abzu and Zuab meant the same thing. The latter spelling of the Sumerian term enables identification of its parallel in the Semitic languages. For Za'ab has always meant and still means precious metal, specifically gold, in Hebrew and sister languages. The Sumerian pictograph for Abzu was that of an excavation deep into the earth, mounted by a shaft. Thus, Ea was not the lord of the endless watery deep, but the god in charge of the exploitation of Earth's minerals. This is a very curious correlation, considering that gold is often called the royal metal, sacred in ancient times, and is the metal most commonly associated with the sun and very often related with solar deities. So we see Apsu firstly written as the sun, and then a physical metal commonly identified as the metal of the sun and sun gods. Wowzy. But you know what? Our discoveries don't end there. Let's now shift the conversation for a moment to explore one more curious relationship between what we know today about human history and the story from these tablets. There is a colloquial mitochondrial Eve theory that scientists first presented in the early 1980s. By 1987, a publication by scientists Kahn, Stoneking, and Wilson revealed that the matrilineal source of our common DNA lineage dates back between 140 and 200,000 years ago. To be clear, the original nomenclature for this finding was lucky muscles, but when a publication in Science titled Unmasking of Mitochondrial Eve was released to the world, the name Eve stuck in the minds of the masses. Just to make sure there's an understanding of these results, they refer to a common matrilineal mitochondrial line, a common root for all humans. What's so interesting here, and why this research has relevance to this part of the story, is that the first collective person happens to come from the same exact time frame and valley that humans were mining gold in. The latest research on this from 2013 serves only to create an even more robust data set to support the original date and region of mitochondrial Eve. Isn't it so remarkable that the original theory, and still prevalent out of Africa theory of human origin, just so happens to point to the same valley where the Sumerian records say that it all started? Coincidence? You decide. Let's now bring ourselves back to the story, sometime around 2 to 300,000 years ago, when Enki created humanity. If you are knowledgeable of Greek mythology, this part of the story sounds very familiar to Prometheus, the ancient titan who created humanity with clay. Like Prometheus, Enki stands up for the human race when he conquers the gods, most of all, Nimrod. From a more scientific perspective, form of advanced technology to clone and create this new kind of being. There's even tablet images that depict a pattern that looks an awful lot like a DNA sequence. Despite Enki's work, Nimrod was still in charge of the operation, and would command Enki to modify the genes as he required. Kitchen explains that the combination of earthly clay mixed with divine blood to create the prototype of man was firmly established by the Mesopotamian texts. We also see this reflected in Genesis 2, where Elohim fashioned Adam from the clay of the soil, and he blew in his nostrils the breath of life, and Adam turned into a living being as the soul. The Hebrew term commonly translated as soul here is nefesh, that belief spirit that carries the body and seemingly abandons it in the physical form dies. Interestingly, the term Adamah, after which the name Adam was formed, originally meant not just any earth or soil, but specifically dark red soil. The Hebrew name for the color red is also Adam, which stems from the word for blood. This name Adam employs a Sumerian linguistic play of double meanings. The Adam could mean several things: one of the earth, one made of dark red soil, and especially the one made of blood. The Sumerian texts also speak of attempts to craft a perfect primitive worker, which along the way resulted in the formed humans created by Enki and the mother goddess, Ninus, which you might remember from her other name in the story, Damkina. Essentially, in an attempt to perfectly match the genome of this prototype with the Anunnaki, there were some mistakes that were made along the way through a process of trial and error. Nin herself also has another name, called Ninmah, and in one particular ancient story called Enki and Ninmah, describes a bunch of awkward failures. In the story, Ninmah produces a man who could not bend his outstretched weak hands, one who could not close his eyes, one with both feet broken, one who was just an idiot, a man who could not hold back his hair, a woman who could not bear children, and a being who had no sex organs at all. With each new failed attempt at a proper functioning human, Enki finds a placement in society, often as servant for the king. Sitchin theorized that the story describes the first phase of the existence of a higher man, a being in likeness and image of the gods, but incomplete in some ways, including sexually, lacking in quote-unquote knowing. However, they were still useful to the Anunnaki's plan as servants in some way, shape, and form. According to this theory, for many thousands of years, Enki continually cloned and created new proto-humans who would grow up to become miners. However, these beings were sterile. They could not reproduce. During the period in which they grew into adults, these first humans were placed in an area where they could be contained and not removed. Sitchin believed that it was only when they grew up enough to be useful to the Anunnaki that they were transported to the mining area of Africa. I will also fully acknowledge that there's some discrepancy in this idea, because the story of Enki and Ninma specifically says Ninma took clay from the top of the alphabet in her hand, and she fashioned from it first a man who could not bend his outstretched weak hands. The use of the location Abzu here, though, suggests that the creation of humanity actually took place in Africa, which also aligns better with the mitochondrial Eve discovery that we looked at earlier. Perhaps then it's just the other way around, and that after fashioning these servants, they were found useful to the Anunnaki in other ways than mining, and were transported to Mesopotamia to help working and maintain Eridu or other locations nearby. Either way, it's believed that the location where these slaves worked in Mesopotamia was a place called Eden, which is the root word for the biblical Garden of Eden. There's a few ideas about this translation. Today, most modern scholars translate the Sumerian term Eden as steppe or plain, suggesting it refers to a large field, I guess. Sitchin, on the other hand, translated Eden to mean home or abode of the righteous. At any rate, it's what happened in this location where things get intense. A dispute was growing betwixt the gods. You see, Enlil is often described as the oppressor of humanity, a bit of a patriarchal overlord who commanded the slaves. Enlil is said not to really care about humanity. He just wants to mine gold, destroy humanity, and go home. The tablets even say that he orchestrates a massive flood to wipe out humanity, a subject that we'll get to shortly. Enki, on the other hand, is described as humanity's champion. Enki cares about humanity and sees them a bit like his children, and while they've been producing all of these sterile slave hands to mine gold and till the fields and all that stuff, in secret he has been continually refining and developing the human genome to produce a perfect human, one who is capable of reproduction and living as its own sovereign species. This story says that Enki finally discovers the perfect genetic pairing and that a real human is achieved. On the subject of the creation of the first humans and this land of Eden, there are two Sumerian myths I'd love to share with you. The first being Enki and Ninhursag, and the second being the Atrahasis. Now, the story of Enki and Ninhursag is a bit long, so we're just going to summarize the essence of it here. Basically, in the story, there's a paradise land called Doom. The story begins with what you might call not safe for work content. So I'm just going to gloss over that for now and say that eventually, Enki eats 8 unique plants in this sacred paradise land. Unfortunately, the goddess Ninhursag considered this act to be a terrible sin. In a way, these are a bit like forbidden plants, and so she causes 8 of Enki's body parts, including one of his ribs, to suffer. Soon, he is on the brink of death. Enlil, along with a magical talking fox who I'm imagining was just scored, takes up Enki's cause and persuades Ninhursag to relent. Ninhursag returns to Enki and asks him 8 times, "My brother, what part of you hurts?" And he responds with the various parts his body are hurt. As Ninhursag heals his body, 8 different beings emerge in the healing process, and the one who emerges in the healing of his rib is the goddess Ninti, whose name means both Lady of the Rib and Lady who makes life. As you can tell, there are tremendous parallels to this story of Eve being created from Adam's rib in Genesis 2, as this is itself the origin. Further, Eve in Hebrew is Hawa, and is most commonly believed to mean living water or source of life. What I find especially interesting about this is that in the Sumerian story, the characters on who Adam and Eve are based on are both deities. While the name Adam comes from Adami, the character seems to be based on Enki, and Eve's name relating to life and being born of Adam's rib really links her with Ninti. Now, the second story I mentioned, the Atrahasis, essentially begins as the Illuminalish ends, with the need for servants for the gods. Instead of Kinu, however, an Anunnaki named Wei-Lu, also Roela, volunteers to be killed for the use of his blood, and his flesh, blood, and intelligence are needed explained by the mother goddess, Ninhursag. With this mixture, she creates 7 male and 7 female human beings all at the same time. These 14 new creatures are exceptionally fertile, and soon there are hundreds, and then thousands of people on the earth, all doing the work which once occupied the Anunnaki workers. The story goes on to say that the humans grow very noisy and even obnoxious, and disturb Enlil to the point that he decides to destroy them all. Huh, didn't Apsu and Tiamat have the same challenge with their kids? I guess history truly is doomed to repeat itself, unless we can learn from our past mistakes. Anyways, the significant part of this story is that it says that they produced the men and women at the same time. It's important to note this because for thousands of years we've been taught by the religious institutions of the world that the man came first, and that seems to pervade through our patriarchal society in a rather uncomfortable way. I hope that today, as we become more aware of these older stories, we might come to have a deeper understanding within us that we truly are all equal, and the patriarchy can fade away into a society that respects and honors all sexes equally. Returning to the main story, we saw Enki and Ninhursag have been toying with the genetics until they could create a perfect being, one who could reproduce for themselves. The moment they did, it marked a huge turning point for everything, because the success of this experiment changes the human genome to enlighten mankind. But as mentioned before, this was the beginning of a huge problem, because Enlil did not want humanity to become a sovereign species of their own. He had plans to make little robot people to work for him, and that he was going to just outright destroy them all. When he found out what they had done, he was furious, and exiled humans from the Anunnaki settlement. Now, as a side tangent, here's something I think you're really going to enjoy. In the first episode of Ancient Civilization of Gaia, Greg Braden explained something that is positively mind-blowing, a very relevant discovery found in our own DNA. Check this out.
New life comes to interest is with the mystery of human chromosome number 2. Human chromosome number 2 is the second largest chromosome in the human body. It forms about 8% of the DNA of the cell. And what makes it such a mystery is that it appears to be the result of an ancient fusion of three existing chromosomes from primates that have been fused in a very precise way, and the fusion site has been modified and stabilized so that human chromosome number 2 is optimized for us today. This has happened in a way that cannot be explained by evolution as we know it today. Why is this important? Human chromosome number 2 contains the genes that largely set us apart from all other forms of life. The cortex of the human brain that gives us the ability for things like logic, empathy, sympathy, compassion, the ability to consciously trigger conscious states of self-healing within our bodies. These are possible because of what has happened to chromosome number 2.
Could chromosome number 2 be the work of a master geneticist, otherwise known as Enki from the Sumerian text?
With this revelation, the tablets give us a significantly different perspective of the Garden of Eden story and our origins. Now, at this time, I have to encourage you to really practice looking at this openly without judgment or fear, because there are deep roots within our psyche from generations of institutional Judaism and Christianity that have essentially indoctrinated us into believing a very specific ideology. For example, the serpent in the Garden of Eden is said to be Satan. Generally, if you suggest an alternate interpretation to this, people naturally assume you must be evil yourself. So with that as a disclaimer, we get to see that the myths on which the Garden of Eden story were based actually suggests that the character who eventually was written to be the snake was really freeing us from our captivity. It was due to Enki's modification that we tasted a form of knowledge that we were not previously capable of comprehending, thinking for ourselves, becoming self-aware, and capable of doing anything, because we were no longer running routine programs, but our own unique consciousness. However, this also came at a price. We were capable of doing anything, including experiencing within us both good and evil. We had tasted from the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. Perhaps this is why the snake was written to be Satan in the creation of the Old Testament, because they had stories of paradise and gods from their ancient history, and the authors naturally assumed that the exile in the Garden of Eden was a punishment. To learn to fend for ourselves from now on. But ultimately, that would bring us to, over the next thousands of years, evolve our consciousness higher and higher and become the beings that we are today. The beautiful thing is, we're still growing, and one day we will evolve to the point where we will know and understand that we are all connected, and we will travel and explore the universe and experience a life almost unimaginable to us today. Now, there's one more fun thing about all of this that I wish to share with you. Genesis 3:8 says, "Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God, who was walking in the garden,
Cover me, I'm reloading!
and they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to them, 'Where are you?' He answered, 'I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid.' And he said, 'Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?'" Okay, let's break this down. First, God is walking in the garden. He's walking, implying he has a physical body. In this classic scene, God is walking through the garden calling for Adam and Eve. He doesn't know where they are. He's God, but he doesn't know where Adam and Eve are. He calls for them, and they come. He doesn't know that they ate the fruit until he sees them trying to hide themselves because they are ashamed. It is only then that he realizes that they've done it. Now, is it just me? I'm a little curious that a being considered an omnipotent creator being would both have a body, misplace his creations, and then not know what they've been up to on his own. On top of that, the name used for God in the ancient Hebrew Bible is Elohim, and this is a word that is not actually singular, but plural. It gives support to the idea that the God the Bible is describing is not a singular being, but a race of beings, or at least multiple physical beings. And as we saw earlier, when Emerald had know what entering down, he was furious. But regardless of what anyone had commanded, human beings were created, and this set them on a path. Humanity stepped into a new beginning, free of slavery, and into a journey of self-destruction. What's more amazing is that all of this was inspired in the Sumerian tablet over 2,000 years before the Bible was ever written down. When discussing the story of the history of humanity, this is the part where there is a bit of a break in the chain, making it very difficult to discern the truth. Keep this in mind for this chapter specifically, because the ancient accounts are very fragmented, and their meanings are not always agreed upon. You see, most stories in the Sumerian tablets document the creation of humanity, and then usually are fragmented until the story of the flood. The flood is a huge discussion of its own, and one that we're going to be exploring very soon. However, there is a big mystery of what happened in the middle. In order to make sense of it, we have to look to a few different sources. It's definitely one of those subjects that I really encourage keeping an open mind about, because there are several different key versions and stories about what happened, from James Churchward's account of Mu, to the Book of Enoch, to Plato's account of Atlantis, which may have even come from ancient Egypt. Along with that, we will also touch upon the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, and other myths and legends from around the world, and of course, Drumbelo's account from his books, The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life, which, as we mentioned before, did an amazing job of putting a complete story together only a few decades ago. According to Drumbelo's version, from the time of Adam and Eve, our race developed in two strains, one that could live free from enslavement, although they were still monitored, and the others that were destined for a life of slavery. After the first humans were born, they moved away from Eden to another part of Africa or Eurasia, where they were allowed to grow and develop their consciousness. Eventually, there was a consciousness shift, and these early humans migrated to a place that was very isolated from the rest of the world. The place that we moved to was called Mu. But prominently today